Hi, I'm Old Norse Specialist Dr. Jackson Crawford, and this is another video in a series of short videos answering questions from Patreon supporters. Now, Auburn asked um, kind of a twin question about dragons. One question being about the life cycle of dragons and whether it's a true aspect of Norse thought that they began as very small and grew to something much larger. I'll talk about that in a second. And then secondly, whether we really should be picturing them as just sort of giant snakes. And I'll get back to that in another couple seconds after that. So first of all, on the life cycle thing, the main Norse saga in which we see this motif of the small snake that grows to an enormous dragon is in Ragnar's saga Loðbrókar, which I often refer to as the fanfic sequel to the saga of the Volsungs. I translated it together with the saga of the Volsungs in my second Hackett book, the saga of the Volsungs, with the saga of Ragnar Lothbrok. But in the first couple chapters in that saga, the Jarl of Jutland, Gautland in Old Norse, gives his daughter a, quote, liten lyngorm, a little ling serpent. So ormur, which is related to our word worm, in Old Germanic languages, uh, that cognate word ormur in Old Norse, worm in Old English, uh, all of these coming from what would have been something like wormaz in Proto-Germanic, means not just the invertebrate, it means the legless animal in general, right? So it actually is the typical term for dragon in Old Norse. We do have the word dreke, which ultimately is a borrowing from Latin draco, probably with the intermediary of a different Germanic language in between there. That's really mostly just used of dragon ships. The beast that heroes fight in sagas and myths is pretty uniformly the Ormur. But this motif that we see in Ragnar's saga, where the girl gets the little snake that grows into a huge dragon and encircles the house, is a motif from continental European literature and not necessarily a native Norse myth. Right, Ragnar's saga reflects many centuries of accreted, not just Viking Age traditions, which there's a little core of in that saga, but also uh, wider medieval European Christian storytelling. I think when we look at old stories in Old Norse with mostly native elements, what we see is no sense of a dragon's lifespan at all. I don't think that, and I could be not remembering something, but I don't think that in Norse stories we ever get a dragon's egg or a dragon's hatchling or a juvenile dragon or an old dragon. A dragon is just a dragon, an ormur. I mean, even the word dragon, you can maybe quibble with whether we should be using it, because I do think that they're basically picturing a giant snake, sometimes with wings. But they always seem to be adults, or there doesn't seem to be any life stage there. And I think that part of what you're seeing is a notion that dragon isn't a species. It's not like Jotun, where, if your parents are Jotuns, you're a Jotun. It's not like human, where your parents are humans, you're a human. It seems to be a thing that issues from someone's character or from a parent's character, rather than their species. And part of this speaks to a Norse notion that character is more heritable than shape is. I mean, the main thing I'm thinking about here is in the Prose Edda, we hear about how Loki and Angerboda had three children. Loki and Angerboda are both humanoid, right? Loki is human-like in most of his forms. Angerboda, we don't have any reason to think she's not humanoid, although her shape or appearance is not described. Their three kids are Fenrir, a wolf, Hel, a woman who looks half dead and half alive, and Jormungandr Mythgar's Ormur, the serpent that encircles the earth. And the gods, we're told something like Thótti allum mikils ils vani, fyrst af móðurni och en vera af faderni. I think something like that is the quote, because I've been staring at the Eddas for a lot lately. I can often remember quotes pretty well. It seems the gods, there was great expectation of evil from them, first because of their mother's side, but worse because of their father's side. Right, this notion that you're inheriting character, right? You're inheriting the personality, and dragon seems to be an expression of personality more than an expression of species. Think about also the other dragon that we know something about, serpent that we know something about the origin of, Fafnir, right? He is the son of Hreidmar, who's a dwarf apparently, brother of Regin, who's a dwarf apparently, and at least seems to begin his life as a dwarf. He also has sisters, Lynghæther, Lolvenhæther. They all seem to be dwarves, and maybe not even that. They could be humans in some traditions. They're at least humanoid. Fafnir becomes an Ormr after he kills his dad and seizes a treasure from him without having the right to do so. It seems to be, although we're never told the mechanism of this, it seems to be that it's more or less his greed, his evil, his willingness to harm those that he shouldn't harm that makes him an Ormr, right? So it seems to be something that's baked into his character. You know, I wonder if the fact that he's said by Sigurður to have something called an Yrgishjálmr, well known from the name, that being the same as the name of that one magical sigil we know from early modern Icelandic manuscripts, Ægishjálmr, in modern Icelandic. This helmet of fear. I wonder if part of what we're seeing here is, you know, and I think on the surface this is just a story, but I think you can scratch it a little and see a little bit of a social metaphor for someone that's turned into this evil, rapacious being by by their greed, and who also accrues this ability to cast fear upon other people, because we do tend to think that those who get away with doing something evil or greedy are somehow, you know, impervious. They're immune to the things that affect the rest of us, and that could be the Yrgishjálmr, right? But those things are vulnerable if we just don't fear them. There's no 2025 relevance to this at all. Um, but you know, it's anyway, it's his character that turns him into a dragon, just as it's the character of their parents that the gods worry about with Fenrir and Jormungandr and Hel. You know, there's no explanation for how two humanoid parents could have a kid who's a serpent, a kid who's a wolf, a kid who's half dead. They don't both have recessive genes for wolf, right? There's no hint of any sort of genetic understanding here, just a sort of mystical, what is that, almost like Lysenkoist idea that you're inheriting things that come from your parents' character, or in Fafnir's case, your own character. There's a lot of serpents or dragons that we don't know the origin of. I mean, one I would mention is Nidhogr, the one that's in hell, chewing the roots of Yggdrasil, and who will fly over the world after it's reborn following Ragnarok. So we know he has wings. So some dragons or Ormar fly. Fafnir doesn't. Jormungandr doesn't. And in fact, Fafnir specifically said to skriða, to like slither like a snake. That's how Sigurður kills him, as he waits for him in his path. But we don't know where Nidhogr comes from. Nothing else is said about him or about the serpents, and there's supposed to be legions of them, as the Onion article got correct, that live under Yggdrasil and eat at its roots. We don't know where those come from, but I would point out that hell and death are naturally, because they're death, associated with evil. And so it may just be that evil places, like evil characters, grow evil beings. And the serpent is the ultimate evil being. And I think that's something a little bit similar to the biblical conception, right? I mean, there's a serpent that stands as the horror in the Garden of Eden and leads uh, the original man and woman astray. And I think that there is something to this notion of the serpent as sort of the ultimate horror in a pre-modern human universe, right? It's an animal that's sort of maximally different from human beings, right? No arms or legs, no facial expressions. It's an animal that can do harm that's hard to understand, right? Because it can have venom that can harm you long after it's bitten you. And there's something about it that a lot of people, I don't find snakes especially scary, but a lot of people have this very visceral reaction to them. Um, and I think it's also generally true that we don't encounter them as juveniles or find their eggs. I've encountered and dealt with a lot of rattlesnakes, real and human, in my lifetime. And I don't think that I've ever seen a rattlesnake egg, although they have to be out there somewhere, right? Um, there's got to be some within 100 yards of me, actually, I would think. Or, you know, I don't know. Uh, I've seen, you know, small rattlesnakes, but I've never seen a baby rattlesnake. I just think that we tend to think of ourselves as encountering them as adults. Now, I've read an interesting recent article suggesting they have actually a pretty active sort of social existence. But that's rattlesnakes in North America, and I don't think that it's all that apparent to people without studying them in depth. So this notion that you have this kind of, you know, ultimate inhuman, unsocial, and always adult being, I think that adds up to something that's kind of scary. And when you magnify it and make it bigger than a person, you really get, like, you know, again, that ultimate horror, whether it flies or not. A very fitting ultimate enemy for a human hero like Sigurdur, or a god like Thor, or uh, metaphorically perhaps for people today to project uh, their fears of and hopes for success against. I hope that made some sense. Uh, TLDR, which you shouldn't put at the end, but yes, Norse dragons, Ormar, seem to be essentially giant serpents, legless beings that sometimes fly and sometimes don't. And they seem to originate because there's something that someone of bad character turns into, or there's something that a parent who has bad character produces because of the bad character of that parent. And that seems to speak to this Norse notion of, you know, the eðli, the nature, the character of a parent being actually somehow more transferable to a child than species. But that's a very ancient or medieval notion about heritability. Well, for now, thank you, Patreon. Thank you for your continued questions, which I'll continue to try to get to even during this wedding month. And for now, from beautiful Colorado, I'm wishing you all the best.